Well, we have a lot to cover today, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. I want to open the event by taking a moment to acknowledge the place where I am and where we might all gather in the future. So, the lands and the waters that are occupied by the University of California, Davis hold the stories of Indigenous peoples from time immemorial. We acknowledge the ancestral and the present relationships and responsibilities to this place for Putwin and Miwok peoples, which is now home to many peoples in the nation. We ask that you also take a moment to consider the Indigenous places that you reside on, wherever that may be, and offer a sense of gratitude for the Indigenous peoples who stewarded this land and waters long before you arrived. You can Google whose land to find out whose land you are on, and you can pay your land trust tax or any reparations if a thing exists where you are. I'm very pleased to welcome Hiʻilei Julia Kawehipaakahaopulani Hobart, a Kanaka Maoli scholar and assistant professor of anthropology at UT Austin, as part of our distinguished speaker series in the Radical and Relational Fermentation and Food Sovereignty Research Cluster here at UC Davis. Dr. Hobart holds a PhD in food studies from New York University, an MA in studies in the decorative arts, design, and culture from the Bard Graduate Center, and an MLS in archives management and rare books from the Pratt Institute. Her research and teaching is broadly concerned with Indigenous foodways, Pacific Island studies, settler colonialism, urban infrastructure, and the performance of taste. Her book on the social history of ice in Hawaiʻi, forthcoming from Duke University Press, investigates the sensorial and affective dimensions of Native dispossession. In particular, she is interested in how personal and political investments in coldness facilitate ideas about race, belonging, comfort, and leisure in the Pacific. And today, we've invited her to speak on the microbiopolitics of poi. Dr. Hobart's presentation will be followed by 2 responses from our research cluster members, including myself, Stephanie Maroney, and Dr. Eviaya Laberth-Hauptmann. You can read more about us at radicalfermentation.ucdavis.edu, where you could also learn more about our research cluster, some of the activities we've been up to, as well as our 2 other founding members, Dr. Jessica Bissett-Perea and Dr. Maria Marco. So thank you all for being here today, and especially to members of our spring seminar who are exploring the intersections of food science and Indigenous studies. Following Dr. Hobart's presentation and the 2 responses, we're going to have a Q&A model that uses a peer review method suggested by Indigenous scholar Eve Tuck. And that means that we will break out into small groups to share our ideas with each other about a potential question that we would want to ask, and then return as a group and pose those questions for response. So we can stay tuned for that. But for now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Hobart.
Hi, aloha mai kako, everybody. I'm so delighted to be joining you today from the overlapping Indigenous territories in Central Texas. I'm going to keep my presentation to about 35 minutes today, and I'm on a new computer, so hopefully my screen sharing will work. 1 second. I should have, okay, let's try that one more time. I'm so sorry. Just give me 1 more second. It's giving me,
I changed a setting just now, so hopefully that will work.
Let me try. I'm sorry about this.
You're welcome to, maybe you can try to share it with me if you want to.
I think I will.
Email. Yeah, Zoom is relentless
It
in
really is.
what we think we can do with it and what we fail to do with it.
I'm just putting the Dropbox link into the chat, Stephanie.
Yeah.
And if you wouldn't mind screen sharing for me, that would be really wonderful. And I'll just let you know when to advance the slides. Did it come through?
Okay, yes, it came through. Let me just download it real quick.
In the meantime, we could all type in. So Jessica encouraged us to state our names and where we are. So that would be great to hear where everyone is listening from.
Good practice has us test these things before the presentation already started, and we logged on early, and I was so excited to be chatting.
And I actually am going to have Dr. Perea share so that I can be more respondent. So we might just need one other second to do that. I could say a little bit about our research cluster too. I kind of directed everybody to the website, but I'm happy to say a little bit more now while we are getting it set up. I see a lot of familiar faces, but for folks who might want to know more about what we're doing, we're a group of researchers and students here at UC Davis or affiliated with UC Davis who are studying kind of radical and relational approaches to fermentation and food sovereignty. So I'll just say as a background, I know Hiʻilei from our work together as grad students. And so when the opportunity came to invite her to talk more about her work, I thought that it would be a wonderful opportunity to bridge some of the science and technology studies approaches, the humanistic research in food studies with our science collaborators. And so I'm really happy that you came to talk about your work, and I think it'll be really provocative and stimulating for this group who is trying to understand how we can work better in a transcultural way. And I'm hoping that your work, and I know that your work does model some of that for us. So thanks again for being here.
Thank you. And thank you, Jessica. We are back in business. And I'm just going to jump into it. Jessica, I'll just let you know to advance the slides when I'm ready. But to begin, this talk generally explores the possibilities and the limits of Indigenous food sovereignty in an occupied Hawaii through the microbiopolitics of poi. A fermented staple food for Kanaka Maoli, poi is and has historically been subject to state regulations that place legal limits upon traditional food practices. While such dynamics are not perhaps entirely surprising in and of themselves, I've become particularly interested in tracking the ways that these forms of settler statecraft emerge from and draw upon discourses of taste, race, contamination, and civility in order to rationalize legal forms of dispossession through laws regarding the cultivation, sale, and consumption of native foods. While the bulk of my talk today focuses on Hawaii's early territorial period, particularly the couple of decades following Hawaii's illegal annexation to the United States in 1898, my goal more generally here is to work on unpacking how food becomes leveraged as a tool for territorial expansion. And this happens on the one hand through settler colonialism's spatial concerns regarding land and by extension agricultural production, and also on the other hand, its biopolitical concerns regarding the management and elimination of indigenous life. And so I'm paying attention here to how discourses of embodiment, such as taste, underpin the governance and regulation of food, and in doing so, reveals the ways that concepts like deliciousness and purity become weaponized by the settler state. Jessica, would you advance the slide for me, please? I first became struck by the way that poi illustrates such dynamics in 2011, when the Hawaii State Legislature voted on and unanimously passed Senate Bill 101, a bill that legalized the commercial sale of traditionally prepared food products made from the corm of the kalo or taro plant. Known colloquially as the Poi Bill, SB 101 exempted Native Hawaiian staple foods like poi and pa'i'ai, its slightly denser and less fermented counterpart, from certain Department of Health food safety regulations. Advance the slide, please. The lobbying efforts to pass this bill, led by community activists, was considered a hard-won triumph and the happy end result of some troubles that had begun 2 years prior. In 2009, after the arrest of Daniel Anthony, who you see here, an Oahu-based kalo farmer who does a lot of really prominent work around the revitalization of Native Hawaiian food practices. For some time, he had been selling hand-pounded pa'i'ai at local farmers markets, which he prepared in the traditional way with a pohaku and a papaku'i'ai, a poi pounder, and a board that you see here. And because of this, Anthony's business violated Hawaii state law on 2 related counts. First, the tools he uses are made of stone and wood, porous objects that can be difficult to sterilize. And second, he prepares these foods outdoors rather than inside a certified food processing facility. In the eyes of the state, this method of preparation invites bacterial growth and so makes its consumers vulnerable to potential foodborne illnesses. Advance the slide, please. These are also the methods by which poi gains some of its most valued nutritive qualities. A naturally fermented food like yogurt or sourdough, poi and its more condensed version pa'i'ai develops its yeasty flavor precisely in conversation with its microbial environment, drawing lactic acid from the hands of its maker. And you can find industrially made poi at most grocery stores in Hawaii, but truly delicious poi is a handcrafted food that fundamentally goes against the Pasteurian sensibilities of the modern American state, which has come to prioritize sterility over the flourishing of microbial life. Poi is, in the words of Heather Paxson, a microbiopolitical object, a food subject to hygienic regulatory governance concerned with health and so-called safety. Extending Paxson's argument, which she makes through the example of raw milk cheese, the modern day regulation of poi emerges not only from anxieties surrounding microbial life, but also deep-rooted racisms that continue to inform colonial relationships in Hawaii around food. Advance the slide, please. In the wake of Anthony's arrest, the sanitation officer for his district tried to explain the situation when he stated that, quote, Mr. Anthony fails to realize that we are not living in ancient times where there were no regulations designed to protect public health. The DOH cannot stand idly by while Mr. Anthony continues to endanger the health of Hawaii's people under the guise of cultural tradition. Setting up a neat dichotomy between a lawless Indigenous past and a safe modern present, the DOH representative drew upon stereotypes that imagine Hawaiian worlds as always already receding into the past. And in doing so, he made visible the colonialist subtext of an otherwise seemingly benevolent rationale for state force, exposing the ways that Anthony's arrest cut much deeper than health code noncompliance. And I think that it's worth mentioning here as a sidebar that Anthony is not Kanaka Maoli himself, though he allows himself to be read and racialized as such. And in using him here as an example, I think it's really important to flag that, but it's a bigger conversation we could have. Advance the slide, please. A legalized pa'i'ai movement emerged in the months that followed. Then University of Hawaii law student Amy Brinker led calls to, quote, indigenize the law through grassroots direct action. And after nearly 2 years of debate, the Hawaii legislature legalized the sale of traditionally prepared poi within the state. SB 101 excluded manufacturers of hand-pounded poi from DOH permit or certified food processing establishment requirements under several conditions. First, that pa'i'ai manufacturers sell carefully labeled batches directly to consumers. And second, that hand washing facilities be located at the place of manufacture. And third, that the maker attend a food safety class. As a cultural exemption within the health code, traditional pa'i'ai preparation would thus be protected as long as consumers themselves assumed the risks of eating foods deemed potentially hazardous under the law. So this was in a sense a step in the right direction, but it bears noting that exemptions, of course, do not upend the systems of governance that police the cultural boundaries of safety or purity, but instead seek to fold in anterior norms as future anomalies. In this formulation, traditional preparations become the exception to the rule rather than the standard that sets it. And with this in mind, and as I proceed through this talk, I'm going to address the historical precedents of the legalized pa'iai movement by detailing the formation of another bill, another poi bill, exactly 100 years prior, implemented during the earliest decades of the territorial period. And these two bills of the same name, when lined up alongside one another, help, I believe, to map poi's radical potential within the settler colonial present, despite continued legal constraints upon the manufacture and sale of traditionally prepared kalo foods. And after moving through this history, I'm going to conclude the talk with some thoughts that are, I think, a little bit more speculative about Kanaka Maoli embodiments articulated by poi and pa'iai in order to think about the ways that fermented foods underscore aina, or land, health, and intellect as interconnected sites of sovereignty and self-determination. Advance the slide, please. And so to get to those thoughts, I want to focus in on the year 1911, when a cholera outbreak in the city of Honolulu triggered a series of public health measures, including eventually a poi bill proposed by the Hawaii Board of Health. Traced to a number of downtown poi shops, the territorial government attempted to stay the spread of cholera by ordering the closure of nearly every commercial outlet for poi in the entire city, effectively eliminating kalo-based foods almost overnight, while the territory's new food commissioner, a man named Edward Blanchard, implemented a health and sanitation campaign for those food businesses that predominantly served Native Hawaiian residents. And here you're seeing a photograph from the 1900s of a Chinese food vendor in Honolulu's Chinatown. And while I can't find any extant pictures of like poi shops, taro and poi would likely be sold out of any one of these storefronts, to just give you an idea of the setting. In itself, this constituted a relatively common form of bureaucratic management within settler colonial food politics. More remarkably, however, and important to the biopolitical regimes of taste that I'm interested in unpacking here, is that Blanchard would go on to hand the cholera outbreaks management over to someone else as he became increasingly fixated on an entirely different issue, which is that he believed that Hawaii's ice creams violated new laws against food adulteration because, he argued, they didn't contain enough butterfat. And so what, we might wonder, did poi and ice cream have to do with one another under the legal regimes of the settler state? How were these two issues even remotely commensurate? The twinned regulation of ice cream and poi set off by this cholera outbreak, I'll go on to detail, makes clear the racial dimensions of food policy, which deployed ideas of purity and safety in order to encourage a long encroaching US nationalism in Hawaii, assimilate Kanaka Maoli cultural norms, and disenfranchise local food economies. As discursive and symbolic opposites, the regulation of poi and ice cream that unfolded across the early 20th century exemplified the ways that regimes of taste politics abet settler food economies by subtly traversing the language of individual preference, bodily safety, and food epistemologies. Next slide, please. Oh, good enough. At the turn of the 20th century, Hawaii's annexation to the United States brought new legal, social, and economic regimes to bear on everyday life, manifesting in carceral forms of control and containment. During this time, the imposition of Western law profoundly affected Native Hawaiian communities in particular, from the implementation of eugenics projects at Kamehameha schools to the establishment of USDA experiment stations that promoted white smallholder agriculture, to the sterilization campaigns proposed by Hawaii's Board of Prison Directors. And these modes of settler governance within Hawaii were, as Maile Arvin argues, driven by forms of white progressivism that characterized early 20th century America more broadly. A set of ideals that marked entitlement to private property ownership through discourses of civility. White progressivism reflected the race, class, and gender dimensions of the settler colonial project. And this phenomenon found particular expression in the governance of Hawaii's foodscape when the territorial legislature passed its first law against food adulteration in 1898. And here you're looking at a political cartoon from the US that was responding to the Pure Food and Drug laws of 1906. This law and those that followed drew from a larger set of US-based progressive era reforms that defined much of American early 20th century food politics. Bolstered by the publication of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, Pure Food laws sought to regain control over a poorly regulated industrial food economy, as well as aim to ameliorate consumer anxieties, both real and imagined, over a quickly expanding food system. And to be sure, instances of food adulteration and spoilage did become fairly common as the food chain lengthened and industrialized. More significantly, though, such concerns over food safety also reflected heightened racial anxieties about immigration and urbanization, often expressed through discourses of digestion, assimilation, consumption, and contamination. As such, the Pure Food and Drug Act's impact on American food was cultural as much as it was political, forging American national identities through consumerism, whiteness, and ideological purity. Given the racial underpinnings of pure food in the US, along with Hawaii's own particular racial demographics, which did and still do hold a non-white majority of residents, tensions emerged surrounding not only Hawaii's non-white producers and consumers, but also the territory's increasing reliance upon food imports from the US. Next slide, please. In the early decades of the new territory, the enforcement of Hawaii's pure food laws belonged to Food Commissioner Edward Blanchard, who arrived in Hawaii sometime in 1910 to begin work for the Hawaii Board of Health. Less than a year into his tenure, he pushed for the Hawaii Senate to revise its laws on the adulteration of food and drugs in order to specify standards for the three foods he believed most susceptible to adulteration, and this was cream, ice cream, and poi. While the regulation of ice cream was not unique to Hawaii, studies conducted in New York stemmed from similar concerns around sanitation and ingredient quality. The concurrent regulation of poi offers an opportunity to understand how American governmentality shaped discourses of taste along racial, gender, and class lines. And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the details of Hawaii's pure food standards, but it's important to note here that the legislature's treatment of foods made from kalo, like poi or pa'i'ai, responded to longstanding and frankly tiresome haole characterizations of the Hawaiian staple food as inedible, wherein newcomers to Hawaii frequently disparaged poi as, quote, billboard paste or other adhesives, as well as queer and transgressive, or simply unsanitary in its presentation, traditional presentation at the center of communal meals to be eaten with one's fingers dipped into a large communal umeke or calabash, which you can kind of get a sense of here. Next slide, please. In contrast, territorial efforts to civilize Hawaii's peoples found especially symbolic traction in the consumption and visual marketing of ice cream. Although the food had been popular in Hawaii for several decades prior, it resonated especially with the social anxieties of the progressive era, in which industrialization and urbanization combined with large waves of immigration, a growing middle class, and a feminist movement for suffrage fomented white desires for racial purity, femininity, and innocence. In much the way that milk emerged as, in E. Melanie Dupuy's words, the perfect food of the turn of the century social reform, ice cream's milky whiteness and sugary sweetness resonated those same ideals within the public sphere. From the vantage of Europe, the US became known as, quote, the land of ice cream. Americans claimed it as their national dish. And in Hawaii, ice cream parlors and manufactories proliferated, catering to everyone from tourists and haole or white settlers to urban Kanaka and remote plantation communities. Likewise, the relationship between ice cream and civility found an aesthetic language in Hawaii, evidenced in the various advertising campaigns of Hawaii's ice cream producers. Raleigh's, one of Honolulu's largest and longest running, consistently employed visual fields of whiteness to underscore the purity of their product. This 1917 layout for a movie theater lantern slide, for example, reinforced its claims of pure ice cream available at the Kohala drugstore with an image of a modestly dressed white woman, dainty dish in hand. Next slide, please. Raleigh's also used Hawaiian identified images to articulate the same types of messages. One such example comes from the 1921 Christmas edition of Paradise of the Pacific, which featured a formal studio portrait of a young Hawaiian girl. Presented without title or logo, the image offers a study in contrasts. Her brown skin gleams against a starched white pinafore. She's smiling, but her lips are obscured by an ice cream cone that sets off her brownness with its milky whiteness. In this way, the powerful symbolism embedded in ice cream's consumption brought race and gender politics to the forefront of territorial Hawaii's urban foodscape. As Blanchard reasoned in 1911, he, quote, "Ice cream is perhaps as widely eaten as any other food and must consequently be watched carefully." Ice cream and poi in many ways represented two important poles of Hawaii's racial, political, and culinary spectrum at the outset of the 20th century: American and Hawaiian, modern and traditional, civilized and barbaric, sweet and sour, frozen and fermented. So that March, when the cholera outbreak occurred in Honolulu, it offered Blanchard an opportunity to capitalize on the pure food regulations that he had been pushing for in the territorial legislature. The Board of Health already believed that Hawaiian foods had been vectors of past outbreaks, and this time, with at least 20 known cases and 18 deaths, all Kanaka Maoli, the government quickly shuttered over 50 poi businesses, destroying in the process more than 14,000 pounds of poi and 9,000 pounds of cooked kalo. Only the Kalihi Poi factory remained open under a strict government ordinance, where the Board of Health controlled all aspects of manufacture, including full sterilization of equipment, employee quarantines, and stringent medical monitoring for signs of disease. Next slide, please. While the shop closures occurred under the impetus of public health, discourse surrounding the incident revealed the colonial underpinnings of territorial food safety. For not only did these measures reflect colonial ambivalence towards poi as an uncivilized indigenous food, they simultaneously seized upon simmering anti-Asian sentiments, particularly against Chinese immigrants who had, since the kingdom era, risen prominently in the Hawaiian food economy as food workers, and who, by the territorial era, owned and operated a significant number of food businesses, including rice paddies, fisheries, and many of Honolulu's poi manufactories. Xenophobia's contours, which deepened through the extension of exclusion acts to Hawaii after annexation, imagined Asian immigrants through paradigms of contagion. Board of Health officials spoke internally about Hawaii public health as an immigration issue, noting that, quote, "From the outside, it is constantly menaced by the endemic foci of diseases of the Orient." Blanchard, tasked with sanitation inspections, reported back that, quote, "The Chinese shops, almost without exception, were found in more unsanitary condition," citing that poi manufacture often occurred within domestic living spaces where families cooked, ate, bathed, recreated, and slept together. The racial underpinnings of industrialized America's pure food anxiety unfurled here as a mode of biopolitical control. Hawaiian sustenance limited through paternalistic forms of protection, Chinese businesses shuttered through xenophobic forms of exclusion. The issue of food adulteration in the territory of Hawaii, in Blanchard's view, was better handled through an investigation of Honolulu's ice cream manufacturers, who he suspected had long been selling substandard products. And that February, just a month before the poi ordinance went into effect, Blanchard had already begun looking into the issue. estimating that at least 90% of Honolulu's ice cream failed to meet American federal standards, and much of it, in fact, did not contain cream at all. And Blanchard wrote a letter to the Hawaii's Attorney General seeking clarification on whether Honolulu's manufacturers would be held to US federal regulations. He drew attention specifically to the Department of Agriculture's definitions for ice cream. Blanchard wanted clarity, he explained, because he intended to prosecute. Next slide, please. And he did. Between April 18th and June 15th, 1911, he mimeographed and mailed violation warnings to 92 ice cream vendors throughout Honolulu. And these letters, in fact, take up almost the entirety of outgoing correspondence archived from Blanchard's tenure. The letter's contents, which quoted section 1041 of the territory's pure food laws, reported that a sample of the vendor's ice cream had been found deficient in butterfat, and that if not resolved, prosecution was imminent. And so given the pressing matter of the cholera outbreak, an issue he personally oversaw in the same month, the energy spent on regulating butterfat standards for ice cream, which pose no threat to public health whatsoever, makes clear the racial imperatives of pure food bureaucracy in territorial Hawaii, in which ideological commitments to purity superseded the very real dangers of foodborne illness. By 1916, Blanchard reported that poi and ice cream continued to be two of the most problematic foods for the territory of Hawaii. And of these, adulterated ice cream violations received more court prosecutions than any other food item, including poi and pa'iai. American federal standards thus produced bureaucratic forms of racial violence in which targeted threats of incarceration sought to cast Asian food producers as duplicitous, Kanaka as naive, and Hiʻilei newcomers as saviors. Localized solutions, in turn, underscored the uneven force of regulation. At the same time that ice cream producers received Blanchard's violation warnings, Kanaka Maoli instead discussed more pressing concerns about the city's poi. Without broad commercial access to kalo, many Hawaiians relied on government rations from the Kalihi Poi factory, which many said tasted suspiciously off. In May of 1911, the Hawaiian Star reported that, quote, the poi that the Board of Health is forcing on the community has something in it. Hawaiians say the adulterant is like vinegar. The poi has the unusual faculty of going sour in a day. Leveraging their own charges of adulteration toward the territorial government, Kanaka critiqued the colonialist applications of pure food politics, which seemed to only care about the safety and pleasure of white settlers. Next slide, please. While Blanchard tracked down ice cream samples around Honolulu, an American disease expert, Dr. Donald Curry, investigated the cholera outbreak by carefully detailing the circumstances of each illness. Presenting his findings to the Board of Health in a special meeting, he traced the source to a stream in Manoa Valley, which irrigated a number of vegetable farms, including several Chinese-owned lo'ikalo or wetland taro patches that supplied some Honolulu poi shops. And this shifted the spatial dimensions of the issue. Several of the infected hadn't even consumed poi, but instead had washed clothing or sourced drinking water directly from the stream. And while this research did not stop officials from framing cholera transmission as a distinctly Hawaiian problem, and one that could only be solved by eliminating access to commercial poi and pa'iai, internal memos such as these suggested the outbreak had the added bonus of cutting off the economic viability of urban lo'ikalo, as well as Chinese-owned food purveyors. The director of the Hawaii Weather Bureau went so far as to suggest in the wake of the epidemic that wealthy Honolulu residents had already been looking for opportunities to overtake these agricultural spaces. Indeed, as the city expanded, the fields began to occupy what could and did become prime real estate. Next slide, please. In other words, restricting poi distribution in the city necessarily, conveniently, and lucratively collapsed the businesses of nearby agricultural suppliers, eventually making the land available for development as luxury homes and the flagship campus of the University of Hawaii. And in the following decades, kalo growers indeed disappeared, first from Honolulu and then from more rural areas, as many abandoned their fields to enter into the commercial workforce, and as Hawaii's people increasingly turn towards a standard American diet. So just as hierarchies of taste become coded by settler dominance in the islands, so too the concept of place would be pulled into capitalist frameworks, affecting what Mishana Goman terms a settler colonial grammar of place, where indigenous spatial constructions contort in order to accommodate the demands of the settler state. And when we consider these landed grammars through the frameworks of food, then the crucial relationships between land, people, and cultural survivance, to use Gerald Weisner's term, become ever more tangible. The dispossessive results of a purported effort to contain the deadly transmission of cholera in Honolulu thereby underscores how the profound territoriality of food politics even when, and perhaps especially when, they are obscured by discourses of safety, purity, and good taste. As US laws designed for public health and safety came to bear on urban Honolulu, they also made visible the gustatory tensions of Western occupation. In particular, the influence of colonial officials like Blanchard, an otherwise entirely unknown figure in Hawaii's history, marked these tensions as he negotiated with the Board of Health to focus government efforts and funds on the regulation of certain foods that, in a time of cholera, lacked any kind of urgency or importance. Through these instances of Hawaiian food regulation, the contours of taste also emerge as a powerful cultural tool to be wielded as a challenge to the state, with Hawaiians leveraging their own concerns and critiques about adulteration. And one can see these shifts in taste politics remain unreconciled in Hawaii even today, as food activists argue for increased and legally supported access to indigenous staple foods, and can help us think further about the promises and limits of indigenous food revitalization that occur under the allowance of state governance. Next slide, please. So to return briefly to the legalized pa'i'ai movement that I opened with, we might consider how at the time, many saw the outcome of the movement as a big step forward for both indigenous rights and food sovereignty within the islands. The legal triumph of SB 101, however, simultaneously revealed the deep investments the state has in maintaining systems that foreclose expressions of self-determination against regulatory powers that favor global capitalism over indigenous frameworks of abundance, to echo the phrasing of Candace Fujikane. In particular, expressions of settler taste tellingly echoed through the language of advocacy, which aimed to draw broad public support for kalo-based foods by emphasizing their healthfulness and deliciousness. In one interview, Brinker, who spearheaded the Legalized Pa'i'ai project and shepherded the bill through the legislature, emphasized how, because of its taste, pa'i'ai offered an ideal platform for indigenous food advocacy because it lacks the flavor characteristics of poi, its more fermented and sour counterpart. She stated, for example, in an interview for Honolulu's Civil Beat, quote, "There are people who may not like poi, but find they love pa'i'ai with its mochi-like consistency and milky sweetness. When someone with a newfound taste for pa'i'ai has trouble finding it because there's not enough kalo to meet the demand, the stage is set for more folks to take up farming." In other words, the quote, milky sweetness of pa'i'ai creates a palatable bridge for those who otherwise might not purchase poi or support kalo farming in Hawaii, thus effectively enfolding kalo into the gustatory frameworks established and perpetuated by settler occupation. Holding these two threads together, the discourses of taste, sweet and sour, frozen and fermented, that narrate colonial food politics in Hawaii between Kanaka and Hiʻilei, and the structural formations of land dispossession, I think offer us a way to consider more broadly the relationships between the territorial and the biopolitical that food consumption tethers together. In particular, that when we talk about deliciousness as a cultural value in the American context, it implicitly references the historical formations that I work to draw out today. In my last few minutes, and in response to this really gracious invitation to talk on the topic of radical and relational fermentation, I want to end this presentation speculatively in order to think through how and why the gut emerges so prominently in Hawaiian histories of food, race, and settler colonialism. And there's something to be said about metaphors of assimilation and incorporation, which I've discussed at various points in my talk today, and you've probably seen echoed in the pieces that you read, especially the one that Dr. Maroney and I co-authored together. And there's also the more subtle dimensions of knowledge and power that drive Western dietetics that often treat digestive health as separate from political context rather than expressive of them, as Native Hawaiian epistemology helps us to understand. Next slide, please. Kanaka Maoli referred to their guts or their viscera as their na'au, a word that traverses the following definitions: intestines, bowels, guts, mind, heart, affections, mood, feelings. Locating such things in the stomach reflects what Kanaka Maoli philosopher Manulani Aluli Meyer terms a Hawaiian embodied knowledge system. To explain how the na'au operates as a location of wisdom and feeling, she quotes kupuna, or Hawaiian elder Abi Napayahi, who explains, quote, "For me, the na'au is gut feeling. Na'au, and when you put ao, na'au au, okay, that's knowledge. It's connecting you to your knowledge as up here your head, because your feelings start from your gut here, and then it comes up here. And that's the Hawaiian way of interpretation. When you get that na'au, you know, when you get that feelings, gut feelings, that you want to do it, you're going to do it. It's not only slang, it's real. And then you feel the power, you know, the mana is with you, the power is with you. You get that feeling coming from here and coming up and coming out. See, it has to start coming from here." And she points to her stomach. Digestion then is more than just a metaphor for assimilation or incorporation, but also an expression of intimacy. It's how we take in and embody our worlds and our relations. And for this reason, just as our guts, our viscera become the site of fantasies about American territorial acquisition and control, they also operate as a key site of resistance to the dietary regimes that would see them as tools for assimilation. And in signaling these bodily sites of knowledge and power, I want to use the na'au to think about the relationship between taste and sovereignty, or more precisely, how the pleasures of taste exceed the individual and what we lay claim to when we describe the values of particular foods in relation to the body. Because I think that we don't get the full meaning of this until we start to think about bodies in their specific environmental, cultural, and here political contexts. So I'll end there. Thank you so much for sticking with me through a talk when I know we're at a time when screen time can feel overwhelming.
That was beautiful. Thank you. Dr. Aviaya Hauptman is going to provide the first response.
Hiʻilei, thank you so much for an amazing introduction to this. It's, to me, reading your work and listening to this talk is such a breath of air and an eye-opener, and I'm so grateful for you and for you joining us today and for the work that you do. So thank you for that. And there are 1,000 things that I would like to discuss, but I'm gonna try and keep it to one thing for now. In reading your works, some of the things that really blows my mind is to see the similarities between what we've experienced here in Kawehipaakahaopulani in Greenland, despite having a very different history of colonization and being at very different geographical areas, having very different diets. I really see some fascinating similarities and also some very interesting differences. And one of the things that I really like, that breaks my heart, is this trajectory where you remove through these policies important foods and you introduce substandard, worse foods that make public health decline, and then you go in and you blame the geography, the culture for not being healthy. And that is really important here in Greenland as well. So and then there's also with milk, or butter fat is another connected similarity, where in Greenland, milk is still pushed through diet recommendations to children, to a population where 50% of us are lactose intolerant. And for me, it's very obvious that the pushing of milk is also a way to push out indigenous foods like odd-dried fish, the capelin, that has a very high amount of calcium. So milk is pushed to children because they need a lot of calcium, but really it's a way to remove a food that has much higher amounts of calcium. So what I would like to ask and know a little bit more about is the status today with government, like how laws, how government, how formal policies are handling these things. Is there a shift towards acknowledging not just the nutritional or prebiotic value of poi, but also its cultural value, its connection to land, and its connection to ancestors? Is there a move towards formalizing that knowledge into diet recommendations, for instance?
Thanks, Eviaya, for a really generous response. I already know that we have many more conversations that we need to be having together. And I really appreciate your note about milk. Like Hawaii has a really prominent Asian population, and a lot of Kanaka are today some mixed race between Hawaiian and Chinese or Japanese, as a history of the plantation economies there. And so a lot of folks in Hawaii are also lactose intolerant. And yet we can see this historical trajectory of embedding milk into the foodscape in these particular ways. As far as the formalization of dietetic support for native foods in Hawaii, I think increasingly over the last 50 years or so, there's been a lot more attention to that. I think particularly in tandem with the Hawaiian Renaissance of the 1960s and 70s, which strengthened again in the 1990s, and continues to go strong today. I think there are a lot of grassroots organizations that work on Hawaiian food revitalization. There are also dietetic projects that were produced in the 1990s, particularly the Waianae diet, which if you've followed the history of like dietary advice and recommendations in the US, the Waianae diet stands out particularly because the strength of the results that returned from the study that found that indigenous people not only experience considerable health benefits from eating a traditional diet, but also that when given the opportunity to continue having access to their traditional foods, would keep eating them, right? That the cultural component was really there, that it wasn't just a matter of eating traditional foods, but also all of the cultural frameworks that surround those, right? From the social to the territorial. So it's interesting to me because the data's there if one wanted to look at data, but I don't think one necessarily needs to look at data in order to understand that traditional foods are beneficial in multiple registers, right, for indigenous communities. And yet that bumps up against these questions of territoriality, particularly in the settler colonial context that I'm interested in, right? Because there's a way within US indigenous policies more generally work to eliminate indigenous peoples on the one hand, eliminate indigenous control over traditional territories on the other. And so the US legal moves to support kalo or other traditional foods in Hawaii is only permitted insofar as it gets used to shore up and perpetuate U.S. occupation of Hawaii, right? And that's part of this like legal unfolding that I'm trying to track here. That these like so-called successes come with limits that prevent something that might look like getting land back, or that might look like self-determination or sovereignty. Thank you, Iviaya.
Thank you, Hiʻilei. So Stephanie, do you want to bring a response now, or is there time for just one other? Okay, I could do just, so another thing that is really also mind-blowing about this is how purity or food safety can be a tool to suppress self-determination on Indigenous foods. And what we've seen here is negative emphasis, like emphasis on negative, potential negative aspects of our foods have resulted in a decline in people's tendency to eat these foods on a daily basis. And that goes particularly for fermented foods that a focus on botulism or food safety issues have alienated people towards these kinds of foods. And I was wondering what also today is the status in Hawaii around eating industrial versus homemade or traditionally made poi, or if like, is the youth eating that as much as elders would do, or how have the developments been in the past years, also with this new bill that actually allows it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it answering this requires like thinking about the economics of consuming traditional foods, because poi, industrially prepared poi in Hawaii today is extremely expensive, along with the cost of living in Hawaii more generally, which per capita, if you include food prices, exceeds that of living in Manhattan, right? And so there's an economic dispossession that's happening here. And I think in the far north, similar economic dispossessions happen with food prices all of the time. And so that is kind of a stumbling block to more wholesale embraces of eating traditional foods, though I do think that there is a really strong understanding of the cultural value of these foods. And one of the ways you can see that, I think, is by looking at the discourse in general, but also by looking at the ways that like traditional Hawaiian foods are consistently and always present at life event celebrations. So funerals, births, first birthdays, right? Poi is always on the table. And so I think right there are these economic challenges that come along with an understanding that these foods are really important. And just another note, in thinking about the examples of botulism that come up with fermented foods in the far north, is that I think that there's something that happens where like one health scare or one example becomes the reason for the elimination of these foods, rather than treating it as like an anomalous event. Because we know that like food safety issues happen pervasively across the US with all kinds of foods, and those foods are not removed from the foodscape. But there's only conversations about how to maintain those foods within the foodscape. So I'm thinking about, romaine lettuce or any of those kinds of instances that we might think of. And I gave a version of this talk a while back at University of Hawaii. And during the Q&A, there was a session where in the Q&A, somebody raised their hands and they were like, well, Indigenous Native Hawaiian farmers who are operating outside of the purview of the state, there's this particular like caterpillar that carries some kind of like horrible diseases eats you from the inside. And they were like, well, what's to be done here? Because the government needs to, maintain food safety. And so, what are you suggesting would happen? And I thought it was really funny because I was like, well, Kanaka Maoli farmers don't want anybody to get sick, like it's not. So that reminds me of that moment, because I think it really speaks to the ways that safety very quickly becomes one of these like hinges to grab onto in order to rationalize dispossession.
Thank you very much for that response, Hiʻilei. I'll pass the mic to you, Stephanie.
Thank you. I likewise am buzzing with questions and things to say. I love your work so much. It touches also so much on the themes that we've been thinking with in this group, which it's just so great. It couldn't be more perfect. And I appreciate that it brings something both new and connective, which is how the territorial and the biopolitical are tied together, which is important and something we've been thinking through. And also how taste, and especially deliciousness, as you said, always comes with historical entanglements. And I think that there might be something about being trained in this contemporary moment to see things like taste and deliciousness as always individual expressions, but that actually they come with historical entanglements and problems that you just so wonderfully, lay out for us here. Something that I've been interested in through this group is thinking through relations. And you've done such a great job of showing how relations are really at the center of poi, and what we're seeing from other members of this group across many kinds of indigenous fermented foods. And that there's just something there are so many things we can say about the land and the plants and the microbes and the people, the knowledges, the processes, the time. I mean, it's the consumptive. There are so many things here that make something like poi possible, delicious, and meaningful, that are centered around relations. And I just was more of a comment of just how wonderfully you've laid that out for us, and that there's a lot to understand when it also concerns the role of the state and of the settler state in particular, where these relations between land and plant and maker get incorporated or assimilated or grabbed into a US regulatory system that wants to treat those things as separate, to centralize production, add vinegar to the kalo, in order to control and survey, formalize, and ultimately dispossess. And I think that the way that you've laid this out in the context of poi is a really helpful model. Not that things will be the same, but it's a nice way for maybe folks working with their own communities to kind of look for red flags of things that are coming in under the language of deliciousness, of taste, of safety, and understand that they might be a part of a bigger process, which I'm sure you're all aware of. I had just two more things that I wanted to comment on. The first was the last time we met, Eviaya had shared some readings from a 1906, expedition from this Danish explorer to southern Greenland. And, I in particular, but hopefully we all were just kind of like, what's this guy's deal? What is this, the bizarre commentary on the lives of Southern Greenlanders and their relations, and reading your the way you talk about Edward Blanchard's obsession with ice cream and butterfat, and we took it as like curious and bizarre and, clearly in the case of Mueller, misogynistic, and racist. But what I really, and especially a concern about bodies being together, in spaces where food is being made, and how these modes of settler governance are really driven by, at that time, a white progressivism that was centered on civility and taste and purity. So I appreciate how, for me anyway, you've shown me something that I thought was just bizarre and strange, and pointed to how it's actually a part of a systemic, approach to this broader dispossession, basically, of native lands and processes. And then finally, and the thing that I would kind of invite you to say a little more on is the, around the kind of biopolitical regimes of taste, particularly around pa'iai, And I noticed on, and you've already laid it out, but I'll just quickly summarize that you're drawing our attention to how contemporary, like, resurgence of interest in saving it, is like for whose pleasures and tastes is this being, advocated. And I noticed on the sticker that you showed us, there was a sticker that said vegan, of pure vegan food. And another thing we've been talking about in this group is like, for whom is that, whose food politics are those? Right. And you're helping us to understand that when there's a call for, an increased demand of po'i'i, and this person you quoted said that the stage is set for more folks to take up farming. It's like, who and what are the limits now of trying to achieve Indigenous food sovereignty under settler governance? So I'm sorry I didn't leave you with a clear entry point, but I hoped you might say just a little bit more on that topic.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. And I mean, you already know what a fan I am of the way that your mind works, and your work in general, and our collaboration has been one of my favorite between the two of us. So I really appreciate your eyes and your generosity of thought about my work. And I'll respond to each of your points, because I just want to underscore some of the things that you're drawing out here. First, in your comment about relationality, I think becomes a really important one. So, for those of you who are encountering me and my work for the very first time, you've kind of seen a slice of my work, but you'll know from my introduction that I'm primarily a scholar of ice in Hawaii, and cold and refrigeration. So I spend a lot of time thinking about energy infrastructures that maintain settler colonial food systems through temperature regulation. And for Hawaii, this becomes a really important thing to pay attention to, because the high cost of living through the high cost of food happens predominantly through refrigerated shipping to Hawaii to maintain the freshness of food. And so people will often remark that Hawaii imports 90% of its food, and there's a huge amount of precarity in that, but the cost of the food isn't connected so much to the shipping itself, but actually the energy company monopolies that need to be paid in order to maintain the freshness of the food traveling across the distance. And I bring this up because I think that there's a tension between economies of control versus economies of relationality. And I think about that in trying to parse through the food systems of the settler state. And so if I mentioned this in my talk, but Candace Fujikane's new book, which came out relatively recently from Duke, called, oh my gosh, why is it slipping for me? Well, anyway, the key idea from the book is to think about the ways that capitalism operates on economies of scarcity, and the answer to that and the way that we can counteract that is to pay attention to and embrace instead economies of abundance. Thank you. Mapping abundance for a planetary future. And for me, that really helps to think about that shift from control to relationality that I think will offer us a way towards self-determination. So that's my first response. To your second point about this 1906 expedition narrative, I have been in the research of this book really captivated by Blanchard as a figure, because he's just like this guy that blips up on the radar of Hawaiian food history for like 2 years and then goes immediately back into obscurity. And I'm a trained librarian, I'm a trained researcher, and I cannot for the life of me find Blanchard outside of this moment of like incredibly banal colonial violence, right? And so I think about, there are so many Blanchards of the world, right? That they're like these bureaucrats that come in and fixate on these issues in these really kind of mundane and incredibly violent ways. So Yeah, Edward Blanchard. If anybody finds him any other place, just give me a yell because I've been looking for him. And then to your final point, in asking about like whose politics, whose food politics become bound up in discussions on the preservation of Indigenous foods. I think it's a question that sticks with me a lot when thinking about different projects that I really admire, right? So I know that, before me, you listened to the guys from Cafe Olone, and they've been just so exciting to think about because of the way that they tether together like settler desire for like not only engagement, but also like expensive fine dining. And they kind of require this attention to settler colonial histories of dispossession in order to participate. And also, I think about this in the context of Hawaii, where in the wake of the legalized pa'iai movement, pa'iai moved onto the menus of a lot of really expensive place-based restaurants in Hawaii that were at once celebrating the indigenous cuisines of Hawaii and also facilitating relationships to like for settler pleasure. And I don't think that there's like an answer to that. I don't think there's necessarily, like, I don't want to come off as criticizing that, but I think we need to pay attention to it even so, because I think it helps us to really wonder about the limits of those venues, right, for achieving food sovereignty.
That was a wonderful response. Thank you. I have so much more to say, but I will not. Namely, I wanted to talk about queerness and I wanted to talk about the gut, which two other things, I love talking about, but we'll save that for another time. For now, I would like to invite everyone. I'm sure that you all are also full of questions and ideas to share. So I would like to create some breakout rooms where you could talk to each other for just 5 or 6 minutes as a place to, share some thoughts you have and potentially come up with a question that you would like to return and ask for the group that can advance what Dr. Hobart has been talking about, and then also just to make sure that it really is a question for her and, not something that's maybe just in your own mind, which I do all the time. So we will go ahead and create some breakout rooms. Thank you, Dr. Bissett Perea, for setting those up. And feel free to just join a group that you are randomly assigned to. And I will set a timer and we'll return.
Bathroom breaks, perhaps. Oh, you're muted, Stephanie.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Hey.
Yay.
That was wonderful.
Thank you. I am so glad we got the PowerPoint sorted out. I was like, there was something in my mind where I was like, you need to test this because you're on a brand new laptop and things don't always work. Anyway, it's like, a lesson that we all should have learned by now.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
Should have, would have, could have, There's other things we're doing, like taking care of little people and trying to make it day to day.
True.
We can talk about anything, but I wanted to say, and I'm sure you know this, but there's this great Upton Sinclair, oft cited quote where he talks about writing the jungle because he wanted it to be a book about worker rights. He was trying to galvanize, a socialist revolution, and he didn't. He galvanized food purity laws. So he says, I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach. And just thinking of the way you're theorizing the stomach, and the heart, and
Oh,
that could be a really fun like parallel between these like different, I mean, they're like different epistemologies um, about, what convinces us to know things, or how do we know things.
oh, I really love that. I had never thought about that quote from Sinclair connected to this before. So I think it's really nice.
Yeah, pretty fun.
Yeah.
Quick question. When would you like me to notify folks that will come back? Should I give them like a 2-minute warning or a little bit longer?
Yeah, they've been in there for 2.5 minutes. I got a timer going. So maybe maybe at the 4-minute mark, we can give them a minute warning, and then we can close the rooms, which gives them another minute.
Perfect.
So it'll be 6, totally. But I think you need at least that much time, huh?
And I would love to, so talking about queerness, since you brought it out, it's like the part of that global food history paper that I feel like was just so cursory, and like that piece in global food history, I think I reread it last night for the first time in probably since it came out, because it was just like produced under like such, how there are some papers where you write them and there's just like shit going on and you're like, I can't go back to that place. And so I read it and I was like, oh, this isn't as bad as I thought it was. But the queerness part of it, I have always been like that. That's not quite nuanced the way that it ought to be.
Yeah.
Like, I think the point still stands, but like, if I had to rewrite the paper, I would have been more careful.
Yeah. Well, I think you were careful. I think there's just it's so much more dense, which is a word that Jessica uses a lot when we talk about the complexities and the deepness of ways of knowing about things that, which again, yeah, not her own. I need to form that citation, whatever relationship. But I think there's just so much more there that we can say. And I talked about Sandor Katz's work on my last presentation for this group, and I continue to think about the complexities of queerness in what he does. And one way I've been thinking about it is about, these fermented foods as a kind of queerness of time that allows us to think outside of capitalist modes of relating to time, to plants, to microbes, to our bodies. And I think that there's something about, I think there's just so much more we could say about queerness, although there is something about the way it's been theorized around intimacy and sexuality that often is the thing that flags it for us. And it certainly flags it for other observers like Twain, right? Is that's the queerness of it, is that it's kind of implied sexuality, disruptive sexuality. But I think there's so much more to say. I don't have a question.
I think that I agree. And I think there's a lot more to say. I don't think I'm necessarily the person to say it. I would love for somebody else to say it. Because I don't think of myself as a scholar of gender and sexuality, right? That's just not I don't know. I think as interdisciplinary scholars, maybe we're always thinking about like where we're afraid of being an interloper. And I think that's one of the places that I don't want to charge too unthinkingly into without getting situated in the knowledge, and also without, with grabbing onto that word and kind of sidestepping or overstepping a deep history of gender and sexuality studies, and going straight to like the materiality of like the environment or nature.
You're right.
Time.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of both. And
yeah, not to vomit my scholarly anxieties all over you or anything.
and I would love to see more work, a more comparative thing, you know, especially like around coldness, which I'm sure is something Arctic folks can speak to better than me.
Yeah, there was a paper came to my mind rereading your work yesterday and thinking like making a paper in conversation between Hawaii and Kawehipaakahaopulani would be really valuable, I think, and so interesting.
Yeah, I have thought really tangentially about your part of the world for a short essay that I published earlier this year on the SSRC blog. It was called On Oceanic Fugitivity, which was about climate change and kind of a close reading of Kathy Gentnell-Kitchener and of Aka Niviana's poem.
Yeah.
So that's my first kind of exploration into like how Oceania and the far north are in conversation with one another.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Charlotte. It's really nice to see your face. So excited to see you here.
Welcome back, folks. You all get the benefit of being some of the first back to the room. So if there's a question, you know, your peer-reviewed question that you'd love to pose now, I invite you to unmute or, you know, show your video if you like, or you can post it in the chat if you would like one of us to read it out loud. So for folks who just came, feel free to ask your question. Maybe use the hand raise function so we can not talk over each other, or post it in the chat and someone will read it for you. Maria, I don't know if you were applauding or have a question, but you could go. Yeah.
Thank you for the raised hand. Hi, Hiʻilei. My name is Maria Marco. I'm in the food science department. I'm a microbiologist, and I really enjoyed your talk so much, and I've learned so much from your reading and what you presented today. And our mini breakout session, Charlotte Bilterkoff was there, and Sean. I didn't get your last name, but wanted to acknowledge you. So one question that we were discussing was, how can you maybe speak to a way that we can be thinking about doing research on poi that that takes into account and works with the need to develop and promote food sovereignty among Indigenous peoples. And just a little context to that is I've looked for research articles on poi, human study, like medical clinical studies or research on the microbial composition.
Mm-hmm.
It's not there. I could find one paper from 2005. So do you think there would be value in doing research on the composition of the foods and health benefit of poi or not? And then if so, how we could do that in a good way?
That's a really interesting question, Maria. I think that I may have been a little bit more successful than you in pulling up documents that talk about the nutritional composition of poi. So actually, if you email me offline, I'll be happy to send you what I have. Some of it's archived in the digital repositories of University of Hawaii, but you kind of have to know where it won't just like pull up on the whatever aggregated thing you're looking at. I think that, of course, it's really useful. It's really great to know these things, and I think anything that helps give Indigenous communities a little bit more leverage to advocate for their own food practices is really important. One issue that comes to mind that I think would require attention is the role that universities have played in genetic mapping of foods. And so if you do some Googling around in poi, you'll see that a number of kalo varietals were like genetically mapped and patented by the University of Hawaii a number of years ago. And there was a big kerfuffle about it and a huge show during which like the University of Hawaii like returned the patents to the Native Hawaiian community, and the Native Hawaiian representatives who received those patents like tore them up because they're like, you can't genetically map our foods. And so there are those kind of like legal frameworks that I think are bound up in institutionally based research on Indigenous foods that I think are really important to be aware of. But for me, in thinking about how this kind of research can support Indigenous communities towards sovereignty and self-determination, really comes back to questions about like territoriality, right? So like, in what ways will this research support the return of lands, Indigenous lands, right? In what ways will this research support the scaling back of imperial occupation? And I think that those are the questions that drive, for me, what this research can do. So I know that those are big things to send back to you, but that's what comes to mind for me. But email me and I'll send you what I have on the nutritional qualities of poi. I see a question in the chat from Amelia, and so maybe I'll just read it and then respond to it. So your group was talking about the monopoly that energy companies have on refrigerated and imported foods and how that contributes to the economy of Hawaii. Yes. We were wondering, do you think it would be possible if folks in Hawaii collectively decided for a month, let's say, to only cook traditional foods or to not purchase as much of the imported foods? So essentially strike that would have some sort of impact on the high prices of imported foods to possibly regain some power back from the settler. That's really interesting, Amelia. And I like the way that you're thinking about like people power, right? And what that can do. The thing that I think about is the economic constraints for a lot of disenfranchised and under-resourced communities to be able to do things like this. And so I think that, you know, these kinds of proposals are compelling and they do something, they obviously do something. But for me, what I always want to think about is like not placing the impetus on the individual to make structural change, but like how can we start to pressure the structures to change instead? And so I think that there's a dialogue that has to happen here. But I agree with you that these energy monopolies are really alarming to me. And I think one of the most alarming things is that like the energy infrastructures have been totally absented from almost all of the conversations about food sovereignty in Hawaii, right? That people aren't even paying attention to thermal regulation because they get so fixated on the transit of foods rather than how those foods are supported in transit. So I think that's really, I think that's really fascinating, Amelia. And I'm gonna keep thinking about that because I like people power a lot.
We have time for another question, so I invite folks to, right on. Go ahead, Charlotte.
Thank you so much for your talk. And I know this time is so short, and I wanted to just invite you, if you would, to say a little bit more about poi and paie as well. But I'm thinking about texture and taste and temperature and the real like viscerality of all of that and how that plays into the politics of purity and settler colonialism that you've been talking about. I know that's a big invitation, but if you could say a little bit more about that, it would be so wonderful.
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. And you probably know that in my broader work, I try to think about temperature, taste, and texture all together as things that are bound up so that we can kind of push beyond these discourses of like flavor that I think are really useful, but also kind of limiting when we think about the ways that like bodies get evoked and underpin these conversations of foods get underpinned by ideas of racialized bodies. Right. And this is where I think texture comes into play with poi and pa'iai. We kind of saw this in the talk, like poi has this really gelatinous texture to it, which is why people often liken it to like billboard paste or glues or adhesives. But that like pa'iai gets rebranded as having a mochi-like consistency, which is, I think, like a textural rebranding that happens. And so for me, I talk about it in terms of deliciousness here, but I think that there's something more broader that we can say about the ways that pleasure gets coded through and across texture, temperature, and flavor, right? That we think about pleasure as being this like individually driven and received thing, when in fact they become they're scaffolded by the historical structures of race and class and gender that get built into how we have come to articulate desire, right? And that we know that our desire is culturally bound. So I don't think that's quite an answer to your question, but maybe more of an affirmation.
There was, we're at time, and there's a wonderful question in the chat that we might just take 1 minute to get your thoughts on. It was from Sophie in a conversation with Barnaby and Caitlin about a clarification about agriculture or industrialization in the context of poi. They talked about a false dichotomy between agriculture and, hunting gathering in Indigenous foodways. And the question is the perception of agriculture a way that poi has become more palatable for Western ideologies? So I wonder if it's also, about content. Yes, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I think 100%, right? There's this idea about Indigenous peoples within the US and under the settler state that, right, when you look at the history of dispossession and agriculture, that there's this idea that like Indigenous peoples are like itinerant and hunter-gatherers and foragers and all of these things. And like, yes, but also a lot of Indigenous communities are agriculturalists, and Hawaiians in particular had intricate agricultural systems. And so, right, there is this idea that like agriculture gets tied to industrialization and that hunter-gatherers get yoked to Indigenous ways of being in the world. But that like Indigenous agriculture is something that I think gets conveniently sidestepped or overlooked as a way to like rationalize these broader systems of dispossession through food. Yeah, I think that using Indigenous foods as like a crux for pushes for regenerative agriculture practices that are happening today around soil health and all of those kinds of things is like both interesting and also can be deployed in kind of problematic ways that rely on ideas about how Indigenous people traditionally gather and get their foods. Yeah, I think that's a great question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hobart, for your time and your energies and your intellect. And thank you to everyone in the room for being a part of this event. And we will look forward to that book when it comes out from Duke University Press. And that's it for us.
Thank you so much, everybody.